The autumn wind smelled like rain. Clyde Monroe felt it as he rode his stallion through the crowded streets of Oakage, a familiar scent that usually brought a sense of peace. But not today. Today, the air was thick with something else, a low hum of excitement that had nothing to do with the price of cattle. He was just here for breeding stock, a simple trip. Get in, get out, and get back to the solitude of his ranch, back to the quiet grief that had been his only companion for 3 long years, ever since he buried his wife, Edna. The ranch was his fortress, his self-imposed prison, nestled in the shadow of the Blue Mountain foothills. It was all he needed, or so he thought. The main auction barn was a chaotic symphony of noise and desperation. Farmers, their faces etched with the lines of a harsh drought, debated futures they weren't sure they had. Clyde moved through them like a ghost, a man respected but not really known, his exile having turned him into a local legend. He was a phantom of a man, haunted by a past he couldn't escape. Then he saw it. Tucked away in the back of the barn, a smaller crowd, a different kind of crowd. Their voices weren't loud and boisterous, but hushed, secretive. He saw prominent businessmen from town, men who wouldn't know a Hereford from a hog, mingling with city slickers in expensive suits. They looked like vultures circling something that was already dead. He heard whispers. Debts, collateral, settling accounts, and then a phrase that made the hairs on his arm stand up. Teaching lessons. This wasn't a livestock auction. This was something else entirely, something rotten. The auctioneer, a man named Roy Ellis, climbed onto a makeshift platform. Clyde knew Ellis, had known him for 20 years. The man was usually a force of nature, his voice a booming instrument of commerce. But today, he looked sick. He was sweating in the cool autumn air, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. "Gentlemen," Ellis started, his voice a pale imitation of its usual thunder, "we have an unusual situation here today." A ripple of anticipation went through the small, predatory crowd. They knew exactly what was coming. Clyde felt his jaw clench. He'd heard stories of things like this in the cities, dark dealings born from desperation, transactions that danced on the jagged edge of the law. But he never thought he'd see it here, not in his town. "Due to outstanding debts," Ellis continued, reading from a piece of paper as if the words themselves were poison. "We're conducting a special auction to settle certain obligations." The property, he explained, came with a mountain of debt. The winning bidder would assume these responsibilities, and with them, certain privileges. Then, from the shadows behind the platform, the property was brought out, and Clyde Monroe's blood ran cold. It wasn't a deed to a failed farm or a claim on a barren mine. It was a woman. Her auburn hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her dress was plain and worn, but it was the geography of bruises on her arms that told the whole story. Her eyes, a startling green, were filled with a haunted, defiant emptiness. She was a ship in a storm, battered but not yet sunk. Behind her, oozing menace, was a man everyone in the county knew. Earl Thomas. A man who'd inherited a fortune and pissed it away on gambling, drink, and cruelty. A businessman whose real business was pain. And the woman walking in front of him was his masterpiece. "May Turner," the auctioneer announced, his voice cracking, age 24, married to Mr. Earl Thomas. The auction was to satisfy his creditors. The collateral was his wife. The crowd fell into a dead, hungry silence. Clyde felt a sickness rise in his gut. This wasn't just business. This was the raw, naked soul of a town's corruption laid bare. May stood on that platform, her head held high, and in that moment of impossible dignity, she reminded Clyde so fiercely of his Edna that it felt like a physical blow. Not in looks, Edna was fair and small, May was tall with fire in her hair, but in her spirit. the unbreakable core of her, a quiet strength that screamed she would not be broken. Earl Thomas stepped forward, a cruel smirk twisting his soft, fleshy face. He was a man rotting from the inside out. "Let's not dance around it, Ellis," he boomed, playing to the crowd. "My wife here has cost me a fortune. Time for her to start earning her keep." Humiliation flashed across May's face, a wave of heat and shame, but she didn't look down. She stood taller, her green eyes sweeping across the leering faces, challenging them, hating them. Clyde's hands curled into fists. The rage was a familiar feeling. It was the same black fire that had nearly consumed him after Edna died, but now it had a target. "The bidding will start at $100, Ellis said, just wanting it to be over. "100, a voice called out immediately. Clyde saw who it was. Ned Walker, a bottom feeder known for his stable of abused women and his hand in every dirty deal in town. The anger in Clyde's chest burned hotter. "125, called another. A saloon owner whose establishment was little more than a meat market. The bids climbed. 150, 175, 200. Each number was a nail in May's coffin. Each bid a promise of a new hell. She stood there, trembling ever so slightly, a prisoner of her husband's sins, watching her future being sold to the lowest monsters in the county. 250, Ned Walker shouted, his eyes gleaming with a sick hunger. "And I guarantee she'll earn every penny back within the first month." A wave of crude laughter rolled through the crowd. May's face went white. She looked like she might finally break. And that was the moment Clyde Monroe's world shifted on its axis. The grief, the isolation, the 3 years of silence, it all shattered. He didn't think. He just acted. He stepped out of the shadows. 500, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the barn like a blade. Every head turned. Silence fell like a blanket. Clyde Monroe, the hermit of Blue Mountain, the man who spoke to no one, had just entered the bidding. And he had just changed the game. Earl Thomas's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition, then contempt. "Well, well, Clyde Monroe," he sneered. "Decide to join the living? Didn't think this was your kind of entertainment, rancher." Clyde met his gaze without flinching. "It's not entertainment," he said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "It's business." The message was clear. $500 was a serious bid. It priced out the scum like Walker. But more than that, it was coming from Clyde Monroe, a man whose reputation for fairness was as solid as the mountains behind his ranch. Whatever his business was, it wouldn't be the same as theirs. 500 going once, Ellis called, practically leaping at the chance to end this farce. Ned Walker glared, his face a mask of frustrated greed, but he stayed silent. He wasn't going to get into a bidding war with Monroe. "Going twice," Ellis said, his eyes pleading for it to be over. But then something strange happened. Earl Thomas's face twisted. It wasn't disappointment. The 500 was a drop in the ocean of his debt. It was something else. Something that looked an awful lot like panic. "Sold!" Ellis slammed his hand down. "To Clyde Monroe for $500. As the crowd of vultures began to grumble and disperse, their fun spoiled, Clyde walked toward the platform. Up close, he could see the true cost of Earl's cruelty, the fresh bruises, the old scars, the bone-deep weariness in her eyes. This woman had been living in a war zone for years. "Mrs. Thomas," he said, taking off his hat, "my name is Clyde Monroe." She just watched him, her green eyes searching his face, trying to figure out what kind of monster he was. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice a surprise, soft, but with an edge of steel. "I suppose I should thank you." "No thanks necessary," Clyde said. "My ranch is isolated. You'll have your own quarters. You'll be safe." A flicker of something, hope, disbelief, crossed her face. But before she could speak, Earl shoved his way between them, his breath a foul wave of whiskey. "Now hold on there, Monroe," he snarled. "Let's be clear on the arrangement. You bought her debt. That means you own her services. But she is still my wife, and I still have certain rights." Clyde didn't even think. His hand just moved, resting on the butt of the Colt revolver at his hip. "Mr. Thomas," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl, "I suggest you clarify exactly what you think those rights are." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Earl Thomas was a bully, and like all bullies, he was a coward. He took a half step back. "Just saying," he stammered, trying to regain his footing with a nasty grin. "A man should be able to visit his wife, make sure she's being properly motivated." "She'll be under my protection now," Clyde said, each word a chip of ice. "Any visits will be arranged through me, and they will be supervised." Earl's face went purple with rage, but he knew he'd lost. For now. He turned his venom on May. "Enjoy your new master, dear wife," he spat. "But don't get comfortable. I'll find a way to bring you back where you belong." Fear, real and stark, finally broke through May's composure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Are you ready to leave, Mrs. Thomas?" Clyde asked, deliberately offering her his arm. She looked at her husband, then at Clyde, at the hell she knew and the mystery she didn't. With a deep breath, she took his arm. "Yes, Mr. Monroe, I'm ready." As they walked away, Earl shouted one last promise. "This isn't over, Monroe. You've stuck your nose in my business. That woman is mine." Clyde helped May into his wagon, his touch gentle. He saw her flinch, a tiny automatic recoil from a man's hand. Years of abuse had turned her body into a fortress. He settled her in, then turned back to Earl. "Mr. Thomas," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "focus on your other debts. Good day." And with that, they rode out of Oakage, leaving the stench of corruption behind them, driving headlong into a future neither of them could have possibly imagined. The ride to the ranch was silent. May sat ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap, a statue of terrified dignity. The immediate danger was past, but she'd just traded one owner for another. What fresh hell awaited her now? "Mr. Monroe," she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper, "what do you expect from me?" Clyde had been asking himself the same question. The bid had been pure instinct, a lightning strike of rage and memory, a ghost's command. "Honestly, Mrs. Thomas," he admitted, "I'm not entirely sure. I saw what was happening and I couldn't let it continue. We'll figure out the rest as we go." She turned to study his rugged profile, the deep lines of grief carved around his eyes. "That's either very kind," she said, "or very naive." A ghost of a smile touched Clyde's lips, the first in years, probably both. As the Monroe Ranch came into view, a sprawling, solid homestead of stone and timber, May let out a small, involuntary gasp. It was beautiful. A fortress, yes, but a peaceful one. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Edna designed most of it," Clyde replied, the name slipping out before he could stop it. The memory was a sudden, sharp pain. "Your wife?" May asked gently. "She passed 3 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and the simple, genuine sympathy from a woman who had just been sold like a horse nearly broke him. His foreman, a grizzled man named Ned, came out of the barn as they pulled up. Clyde noted the name with a grim irony. A different Ned Walker had bid on May, but this was his Ned. A man who'd worked for his father. A man he trusted with his life. Ned's eyes widened at the sight of May, but he said nothing. "Ned," Clyde said, his voice all business, "this is Mrs. Thomas. She'll be staying with us. Help her with her things." May gave a short, bitter laugh. "I don't have any things, Mr. Monroe, just what I'm wearing." The words hit Clyde like a punch to the gut. Earl hadn't even let her pack a bag. She had nothing, not a single possession to call her own. "We'll fix that," Clyde said, his voice thick with a sudden, protective anger. "Let's get you settled." He helped her down, and he watched as she scanned her new surroundings. She wasn't admiring the view. She was mapping it, looking for exits, sizing up threats. It was the calculus of the hunted. Inside, the house was clean, solid, masculine. It was a house without a woman's touch, a place where a man was simply existing, not living. "There's a guest room upstairs," Clyde told her. "It has a lock on the door." Her eyes widened. A lock. The simple promise of a door that could not be opened from the outside was a luxury she hadn't known for years. It was the promise of a moment's peace, a place where she could finally breathe. "That's very considerate," she said, her voice trembling. He led her to the room. It was simple, but clean. A bed, a dresser, a rocking chair by a window that looked out over the valley. "There are some clothes in the dresser," Clyde said, the words catching in his throat. "They were Edna's. She was about your size. She would have wanted them to be used." That was what finally broke her. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and slow. To be offered the clothes of a beloved dead wife was an act of such profound trust, such shocking generosity, that she didn't know how to process it. "Mr. Monroe, It's practical," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with her emotion. "Dinner's at 6. He left her there and went downstairs, the silence of the house suddenly feeling different. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. He poured a whiskey, the amber liquid doing nothing to calm the storm inside him. What had he done? He'd brought a wounded bird into his quiet sanctuary, and he knew her predator would soon come circling. Ned was waiting for him, his weathered face creased with concern. "Boss? Something I should know?" Clyde took a long drink. "Her husband sold her to pay his gambling debts," he said bluntly. "I bought the debts." Ned's face darkened. "Dios mio," he muttered. "What kind of man sells his wife?" "The kind who won't let her go easily," Clyde said grimly. "She's under our protection now, and I expect trouble." Ned nodded, his hand instinctively going to the knife on his belt. "The boys and I will keep our eyes open, boss. No one's getting on this ranch that ain't welcome." Upstairs, May locked the door. The sound of the bolt sliding home was the sweetest music she had ever heard. She ran her hand over the smooth wood of the dresser, touched the cool glass of the window pane. She opened the drawers and found the clothes. Simple dresses, soft woolens, all smelling faintly of lavender. She pulled on a plain blue dress and looked at herself in the mirror. A stranger stared back. A thin, bruised woman with haunted eyes. But for the first time in a very long time, there was a tiny spark in those eyes. A flicker of something that might one day become hope. At dinner, Clyde pulled out her chair. The simple courtesy, another forgotten kindness, made her want to weep again. The food, plain ranch fare, tasted like a banquet. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the clinking of forks and the storm that had finally broken outside, rain lashing against the windows. "Mr. Monroe," she said finally, putting her fork down, "I have to be honest. I don't know what value I can provide to justify your investment. I am not a good cook. I have no skills." She was pricing herself, like livestock. The thought made him furious. "Mrs. Thomas," he said, his voice firm, "let's be clear. You are not an investment. You are not here to earn your keep. You are here because what was done to you was wrong, and I would not let it stand. That is all." She stared at him, bewildered. "But the legal arrangement..." "The legal arrangement gives me certain rights," Clyde cut in, "and I choose not to exercise them. You are a guest in this house. Nothing more, nothing less." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. "Why?" Clyde looked out the window at the storm, at the reflection of the lonely, grieving man he had been for 3 years. "Because my wife Edna, believed that everyone deserves dignity. She believed that kindness was the only thing that truly mattered. I had forgotten that, until today. Later that night, as May lay in a real bed, in a locked room, listening to the rain, she allowed herself a dangerous thought. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally safe. But safety was an illusion. And out in the storm, forces were already moving. Earl Thomas was not a man to accept public humiliation. The morning after the auction, he rode out to the Monroe Ranch, not alone, but with the town's sheriff, a weasel of a man named Blevins who was squarely in Earl's pocket. Clyde saw them coming from a mile away, two riders cutting through the morning mist. He met them on the porch, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. "Monroe," Earl snarled, staying on his horse, "I'm here to see my wife." "She doesn't want to see you," Clyde said calmly. "That's not her decision to make," Sheriff Blevins chimed in, puffing out his chest. "Legally, Mr. Thomas has a right to visit his lawfully wedded wife." "This is my property, Sheriff," Clyde said, his eyes never leaving Earl, "and you're not welcome on it." "Now see here, Monroe," Blevins sputtered. "You're obstructing an officer of the law." "I see a man on my land who isn't welcome," Clyde repeated, his voice dangerously low. "I suggest you both leave. Now." Earl's face was a mask of fury. He had expected the reclusive rancher to fold. He hadn't expected this iron resolve. "This isn't over," he spat, wheeling his horse around. "I'll have the law on you. I'll have her back." As they rode off, Clyde knew this was just the first move in a much deadlier game. He went back inside, his mind racing. He found May in the kitchen, her hands white-knuckled on the back of a chair. She'd seen them from the window. "He won't stop," she whispered, her voice hollow. "You don't know him. He will never, ever stop." "Let him try," Clyde said. But that night, the real trouble began. Under the cover of darkness, two of Clyde's best bulls had their throats cut. It was a message, a costly one. It wasn't just about May anymore. It was about breaking him. The next few days were a blur of tension. Clyde and his men, led by the ever-loyal Ned, fortified the ranch. They rode patrols, their rifles always ready. The Monroe Ranch had become a fortress under siege. May, seeing the grim determination in their faces, felt a surge of guilt. This was her fault. She had brought this war to this good man's door. One evening, she found Clyde in his study, poring over his account books, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Mr. Monroe," she started, her voice hesitant. This is too much. You should let me go. Let me walk away. He'll follow me, and he'll leave you in peace." Clyde looked up, his eyes tired but fierce. "And go where, Mrs. Thomas? Back to him? To another auction? No. The line is drawn here. This is not just about you anymore. It's about what's right." He stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. "He thinks he can break me. He thinks he can take whatever he wants. Men like him, they have to be stopped." Then he turned back to her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. A question. "He's willing to risk a war with me, lose his reputation, all for you. Why? Is it just pride? Or is there something else? Something you're not telling me?" May's blood ran cold. He saw it. He saw the corner of the secret she had guarded with her life. The secret that was the real reason Earl would burn the world down to get her back. She hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of fear. Trust was a foreign country to her. But looking at Clyde, at the man who had bought her, sheltered her, and was now risking everything for her, she knew she had no other choice. "It's not about his gambling debts," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "That was a lie, a cover story for the town." Clyde just watched her, his expression unreadable. "He's part of something bigger," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A group of men. The ones you saw at the auction. They run this county. The sheriff, the judge, the businessmen. They use his mines to launder money. They do terrible things, Mr. Monroe. And Earl, he kept records. Clyde's eyes sharpened. Records? A ledger, she whispered. He was meticulous. Every name, every date, every illegal transaction. He was a fool, but he was a careful fool. He thought it was his insurance, his power over them. Where is this ledger? Clyde asked, his voice tight. May took a deep, shuddering breath. When he told me about the auction, when he was drunk and bragging about it, I knew I had to do something. I took it. I took the ledger. Clyde stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying speed. The auction wasn't about debt. It was a trap. Earl's powerful partners had found out about his ledger. They couldn't risk him talking, so they forced him into a public, humiliating auction to sell his wife, knowing he would be desperate to get her and the ledger back under his control. The bidders, men like Ned Walker, weren't just random scum. They were part of the conspiracy, there to ensure she went to one of them. But Clyde Monroe had ruined their plan. He, the outsider, the hermit, had walked in and bought the one woman who could bring them all down. And now he understood the cold panic in Earl's eyes when he'd won the bid. It wasn't about losing his wife. It was about losing control of the evidence that could send them all to the gallows. Where is it, May? He asked again, his voice urgent. The ledger. Where is it? She looked at him, her green eyes filled with a terrifying mix of fear and resolve. I hid it. It's safe. But if they know I have it. They don't know, Clyde said, thinking fast. They just think you know things. They want you back to silence you. But the ledger, that changes everything. It's not just your word against theirs. It's proof. A sudden chilling thought struck him. The attacks on his ranch, the slaughtered cattle. It wasn't just Earl's wounded pride. It was a probe, a test. They were trying to see how much of a fight he had in him before they came for May in force. The siege was about to get a whole lot worse, because now it wasn't just about silencing a woman. It was about retrieving the evidence that could destroy them all. The revelation of the ledger changed the air on the ranch. The tension, already thick, became suffocating. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. Clyde knew they were no longer dealing with a spurned husband. They were at war with a criminal conspiracy that had its tentacles wrapped around the entire county. He had to see the proof for himself. May, he said that night, his voice low. I need to see it. She nodded, her face pale in the lamplight. She led him not to her room, but to the main floor, to the grand stone fireplace that was the heart of the home. A fireplace Edna had designed. With trembling hands, May knelt and worked a loose stone from the hearth. It was a spot no one would ever think to look, a tiny flaw in an otherwise perfect construction. From the dark cavity behind it, she pulled a slim, leather-bound book. Clyde took it. The book was heavier than it looked, weighted with the sins of powerful men. He opened it, and his blood ran cold. It was all there. Names he recognized. Sheriff Blevins, Judge Harrison, half the merchants in Oakage. Next to their names were figures, dates, and coded notes detailing extortion, illegal land grabs, and money funneled through Earl's mining operations. It was a detailed map of the county's rotten soul. And at the center of the web was a name Clyde didn't recognize, referred to only as the director. This is a death warrant, he breathed, looking at May with a new, profound respect. The courage it must have taken to steal this. I know, she whispered. That's why he has to get me back. If I talk, they all go down. He won't get you back, Clyde vowed, his hand closing over hers. It was an unconscious gesture, a promise of protection that was more solid than any words. We're going to use this. We're going to burn them to the ground. But how? The local law was corrupt. The judge was in on it. Going to them would be suicide. They were on their own, an island in a sea of enemies. Their only hope was to get the ledger to the U.S. Marshals in the territorial capital, a 3-day ride away. But leaving the ranch would be a death sentence. Earl's men were watching. They had to be. The next morning, the proof arrived. One of Clyde's ranch hands, a young kid named Billy, was found at the edge of the property. He hadn't been shot. He'd been beaten to death. A warning. A brutal, bloody statement that the gloves were off. Panic began to creep into the morale of Clyde's men. They were ranchers, not soldiers. They'd signed on to herd cattle, not fight a private war. Clyde gathered them in the barn, the body of the boy lying under a canvas sheet. "I know some of you are scared," he said, his voice raw with grief and fury. "What's happening here? It's bigger than any of us. These men, they want to take what's mine. They want to hurt the people under my protection, and they will not stop. I won't ask any of you to stay. If you want to ride out, no one will think less of you. Your pay is good." He looked from face to face. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw anger, loyalty. These were hard men, and their boss, the quiet, reclusive Clyde Monroe, had just had one of their own murdered in cold blood. It was Ned, his trusted foreman, who spoke first. "We ain't going nowhere, boss," he said, his voice a low growl. "We started with you. We'll finish with you. You just tell us what to do." A murmur of agreement ran through the men. They were staying. They were in this to the end. Clyde felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He wasn't alone. But as he looked at the resolute face of his foreman, a tiny splinter of doubt lodged itself in his mind. It was nothing, a flicker of something in Ned's eyes as he glanced away. Clyde dismissed it. Ned had been with his family for 20 years. He was as solid as the mountains. It was the stress, the paranoia, getting to him. He had to be wrong. The plan was desperate. They couldn't ride out in force. They'd be seen for miles. Someone had to slip away alone, under the cover of darkness, and make a run for the capital. It was a suicide mission. "I'll go," Clyde said. It was his fight. "No," May said, stepping forward. "They're watching for you. They're not watching for a woman. I can ride. I grew up on a farm. Give me your fastest horse. I can make it." He wanted to refuse. The thought of sending her out into that danger was unbearable. But she was right. They would be looking for a man, for Clyde Monroe. A woman riding out might just be mistaken for a rancher's wife heading to a neighbor's. She had the better chance. But there was another problem. The ledger was the original. If she was caught, the evidence was lost forever. They needed a copy. May revealed another of her secrets. In her previous life, before Earl, she had been a governess. She had a fine, clear hand and a knack for calligraphy. For the next 2 days, hidden away in Clyde's study, she worked feverishly, transcribing every name, every number from the ledger into a new book. Her hand was steady, her focus absolute. Clyde watched her, marveling at her strength. This was not the broken woman he had bought at auction. This was a warrior. As she worked, they talked. She told him of her life with Earl, the years of pain and fear, the slow crushing of her spirit. And he, in turn, found himself talking about Edna. He told May about her laughter, her kindness, her dream of building a real home here in this valley. Sharing the memories didn't hurt as much as he thought it would. It felt right. A bond was forming between them, forged in shared danger and quiet confession. The night of May's departure arrived. A moonless, windy night, perfect for a secret ride. Clyde gave her his best horse, a black mare named Shadow that was as fast as the wind. He gave her a small pistol and showed her how to use it. "Ride hard and don't stop for anything," he told her, his hands on her shoulders. "Don't trust anyone you meet on the road." "I'll be careful," she promised. He watched her ride out, a small, determined figure swallowed by the immense darkness. The fate of the ranch, of his life, of justice itself, now rested on her shoulders. He turned to Ned, who was standing beside him on the porch. "They'll come for us now," Clyde said. "They'll know she's gone soon enough. They'll throw everything they have at us, thinking she still has the ledger." "Let 'em come," Ned said, spitting on the ground. "We'll be ready for 'em." But as Clyde watched his trusted foreman walk back toward the bunkhouse, the splinter of doubt returned, sharper this time. Something Ned had said earlier that day, something that didn't add up. He'd been talking about the patrol routes, and he'd mentioned the old Eastern Trail being washed out, but Clyde knew for a fact it wasn't. He'd ridden it himself just yesterday. It was a small lie, a meaningless detail, unless it wasn't, unless it was a signal, a way of telling someone that a certain part of the ranch perimeter would be unguarded. Clyde's blood went icy cold. He thought back. Ned was the one who found Billy's body. Ned was the one who had argued most strongly for a defensive posture, for them to hole up and wait. Was it loyalty, or was he trying to keep them pinned down, to keep the ledger from getting out? And then the most damning piece fell into place. The cruel bidder at the auction, Ned Walker. His foreman's name was Ned Allen. Close, but not the same. But what if it was a lie? What if the foreman he'd known for years was related to the scumbag from town? Brothers? Cousins? What if his loyalty wasn't to the Monroe family, but to something else entirely? He felt sick. The man he trusted with his life, the man who stood by him. It couldn't be. But he had to know. Leaving the house, he didn't go to the barn. He circled around, moving through the shadows like a predator. He went to the bunkhouse, but not to the main door. He went to the small window at the back of Ned's private room. It was dark, but a sliver of light shone from under the door. He heard voices. One was Ned's. The other was low, guttural. A voice he didn't recognize. He crept closer, pressing his ear to the rough wooden wall. "She's gone," Ned was saying. "Rode out about an hour ago, headed east, on Monroe's best horse." "Does she have it?" the other voice asked. "She has to," Ned replied. "He wouldn't have let her go otherwise. They'll be waiting for her at Miller's Crossing. No way she gets through." Clyde felt the world tilt. Miller's Crossing, an ambush. He'd sent May straight into a trap set by the man standing right beside him. "Good," the other voice said. "Thomas and the others will move on the ranch at dawn. With her gone, Monroe is just a loose end. We kill him, burn the place to the ground, and say it was an accident. The ledger will be recovered, and everything goes back to the way it was." "What about my money?" Ned asked, a whine of greed in his voice. "You'll get what you were promised once the book is back in our hands," the voice said. "Now get back out there. Act loyal. Monroe can't suspect a thing." The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it stole the air from Clyde's lungs. His father had hired Ned. He'd played with Ned's children. He had trusted him completely. And all this time, the snake was coiled right at his feet. Rage, cold and pure, washed over him. He had to warn May. But how? He was trapped. By dawn, Earl's army would be at his door, and his own second in command was the one opening the gate. He backed away from the window, his mind a whirlwind. He was out of time. May was riding to her death. His men were about to be slaughtered. The proof that could save them all was with her. He had made a fatal mistake. He had trusted the wrong man, and now everyone was going to pay the price. The night was a ticking clock. Clyde raced back to the main house, his mind a frantic storm. He couldn't ride after May himself. The moment he left, Ned would know he'd been discovered, and the attack would begin immediately. He couldn't trust any of his men to send after her, because he didn't know who else might be on Ned's payroll. He was utterly, completely alone. He stood in his study, the duplicate ledger, the real one, on his desk. May was carrying a fake. That was the only piece of luck he had. He'd insisted on it at the last minute, a gut feeling he couldn't explain. He'd told her the original was too valuable to risk, that a perfect copy would be just as good. Now that gut feeling was the only thing keeping the entire enterprise from collapsing. But May was still riding into an ambush. He had to stop her. He looked at the map on his wall. Miller's Crossing was the most direct route east. But there was another way. The old hunter's path, through the treacherous terrain of Devil's Ridge. It was dangerous, nearly impassable at night, but it bypassed the crossing entirely. If he could just get a message to her, he needed a messenger no one would suspect. His eyes fell on a photograph on the mantel. It was Edna, standing beside a young stable boy. The boy's name was Thomas, the son of his housekeeper, Ruth. He was barely 15, but he knew the foothills like the back of his hand. And more importantly, he idolized Clyde. He was loyal to the Monroe brand, not to a foreman. Clyde found the boy in the small cottage he shared with his mother near the main house. He woke him gently. "Thomas," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need you to do something for me. It's the most important thing I will ever ask of you." He explained the situation in hushed, rapid tones. The betrayal, the ambush, the alternate route. He didn't give the boy a written note. It was too risky. He just made him memorize the message. "Tell her Devil's Ridge. Tell her the ledger she has is a copy. The real one is safe. Tell her to ride for Fort Grant, not the capital. I'll meet her there." Fort Grant was a military outpost, not a civilian town. It was the one place the conspiracy's influence couldn't reach. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded, his face set with a grim determination that made him look older than his years. "I won't fail you, Mr. Monroe." "Take the West Trail," Clyde instructed. "Ned thinks it's unguarded. He's saving it for Earl's men. You're small. You can slip through. Go now, and Godspeed." As Thomas melted into the darkness, Clyde turned his attention to the second problem: surviving until dawn. He knew he couldn't confront Ned directly. The foreman had the loyalty of the men. If it came down to his word against their trusted friends, Clyde wasn't sure who they would believe. He had to neutralize Ned without tipping his hand. He found Ned in the barn making a show of checking the horses. "Ned," Clyde said, his voice steady. "Change of plans. I've been thinking. You were right. We're too exposed here. We need to pull back, fortify the main house. I want you to take 2 men and ride to the North Ridge. Set up an observation post. I want to know the second you see dust." It was a gamble. The North Ridge was miles away, a pointless position for an observation post. If Ned was innocent, he'd question the strange order. If he was guilty, he'd see it as an opportunity, a chance to be away from the main house when the attack came, giving him plausible deniability. Ned's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second. "Good idea, boss," he said, a little too quickly. "We can't let them surprise us. I'll take Johnson and Pete." He had taken the bait. Clyde watched him ride out with the 2 men, disappearing into the night. That bought him a few precious hours. Now, for the rest of his men. He couldn't tell them their foreman was a traitor. It would shatter their morale. He needed to move them, to position them, without explaining why. He gathered the remaining 6 men. "Listen up," he said, his voice ringing with an authority they had rarely heard. "Ned's on watch, but I've got a bad feeling. The attack isn't coming from the east, where they're expecting it. It's coming from the west." He pointed to the trail Thomas had just taken. "They think we've left it open. We're going to set a trap of our own." It was a lie built on a truth. They would be coming from the west. Ned had made sure of it. He positioned his men not at the main gate, but in the rocks overlooking the narrow western trail. He laid out boxes of ammunition. He armed them with every rifle and shotgun on the ranch. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and half of them were walking into a battle without knowing the real enemy. The waiting was the hardest part. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every rustle of leaves, every hoot of an owl, sounded like the prelude to death. Clyde stood with his rifle, the real ledger now tucked inside his coat, its weight a constant reminder of what was at stake. He thought of May, hoping Thomas had reached her in time. He thought of Edna, and whispered a prayer to a heaven he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. Just as the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky, he heard it, the soft clink of a horseshoe on rock, then another. They were coming. He counted at least 20 riders moving silently up the trail, led by Earl Thomas and Sheriff Blevins. They were moving with the confidence of men who believed the gate was being opened for them from the inside. Clyde raised his hand, then brought it down. "Now," he whispered. 7 rifles opened up as one. The quiet dawn exploded into a chaotic hell of gunfire and screams. The ambush was perfect. The attackers, caught in the narrow canyon, had no cover. Horses screamed and fell. Men dropped from their saddles. Earl Thomas, the coward, was at the back. He immediately wheeled his horse and fled, leaving his men to be slaughtered. Blevins, trying to follow, took a bullet in the arm and tumbled to the ground, squealing like a pig. The firefight was brutal and short. The surviving attackers broke and ran, melting back into the darkness they had come from. In the sudden silence, Clyde's men let out a ragged cheer. They had done it. They had repelled the attack. But Clyde knew it wasn't over. 3 riders were approaching from the north. It was Ned and his 2 men, drawn by the sound of the battle. "Boss!" Ned shouted, riding up, his face a perfect mask of concern. "What happened? We heard shooting!" Clyde walked toward him, his shotgun held loosely at his side. His men gathered around, confused. "Funny, Ned," Clyde said, his voice dangerously soft. "The attack came from the west, just where you said was washed out. They rode in expecting a friendly welcome." Ned's face went pale. He knew. "Boss, I don't know what you're talking about." "I heard you, Ned," Clyde said, raising his voice so all the men could hear. "I heard you in the bunkhouse. I heard you selling us out. I heard you set May up to be murdered at Miller's Crossing." A collective gasp went through the men. They looked from Clyde to their foreman, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. Ned's hand twitched toward his pistol. "He's lying. The pressure's gotten to him. He's gone crazy." "Am I?" Clyde said. He turned to the 2 men who had ridden with Ned. "Johnson, Pete, he told you to ride to the North Ridge, right? To stand watch?" The 2 men nodded, confused. "Did he ever actually look for the enemy?" Clyde pressed. "Or did he just find a nice spot and tell you to wait until you heard gunfire from the main house?" Johnson and Pete exchanged a look. That's exactly what had happened. They hadn't patrolled. They'd just waited. The truth was dawning on everyone's faces. The betrayal was real. Ned saw it. He saw the trust in the men's eyes turning to contempt. With a desperate roar, he drew his pistol. But Clyde was faster. The shotgun bucked in his hands, and Ned was thrown from his saddle, his chest a bloody ruin. He hit the ground, dead before the echo of the blast faded. In the stunned silence that followed, Clyde Monroe stood over the body of the man he had once called a friend. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Earl Thomas was still out there. His conspiracy was still in power, and May was still riding for her life. The sun rose on a battlefield. Clyde and his men tended to the wounded, their own and the few of Earl's men who hadn't been killed or fled. Sheriff Blevins was among them, whimpering about his arm. His authority vanished. He was just a criminal now, and everyone knew it. They locked him in the root cellar. Clyde knew they had a very small window of time. Earl would be back, and next time he wouldn't come with 20 men. He'd come with 100. The whole corrupt county would descend on them. Their only hope was May. He gathered his remaining loyal men. "Ned betrayed us," he said, his voice heavy. "He was working for Thomas. He sent May into an ambush. I sent Thomas to warn her, to send her to Fort Grant. But we don't know if he made it. Our fight isn't over. We're leaving. Now." They packed what they could. Ammunition, food, water. They were abandoning the ranch. The home Clyde's father had built, the home Edna had made beautiful. It was a heart-wrenching decision, but the ranch was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. "We burn it," Clyde said, his voice hollow. "We don't leave them anything." They herded the horses and remaining cattle out into the valley, then set torches to the barn, the bunkhouse, and finally, the main house itself. Clyde stood and watched as the flames consumed his past. He watched the home filled with Edna's memory turn to ash and smoke. It was a funeral pyre for the life he had known, but as he watched it burn, he didn't feel grief. He felt a strange, cold sense of liberation. He was no longer the hermit of Monroe Ranch. He was just a man with a promise to keep. They rode east, a small, ragged army pushing their horses hard. Clyde's mind was a maelstrom of worry. Had Thomas reached May? Was she safe? Or was she already dead, her body lying in a ditch near Miller's Crossing? The uncertainty was a physical torture. 2 days later, as they neared the hills surrounding Fort Grant, they saw riders approaching. Clyde's men raised their rifles, preparing for another fight. But Clyde held up a hand. He recognized the riders. They were wearing the blue coats of the U.S. Cavalry, and riding at the head of the column, beside a grim-faced captain, was May. She was alive. The relief that washed over Clyde was so powerful he felt his knees weaken. She saw him and broke from the column, galloping toward him. She reined in her horse, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes shining with tears. "Clyde," she breathed. "You made it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Tomas found me," she explained, her words tumbling out. "He was so brave. He cut across the ridge just as I was nearing the crossing. He told me everything. We rode to the fort together." She had arrived at Fort Grant with her incredible story and the fake ledger. The captain was skeptical at first, but the attempted ambush at Miller's Crossing, which his patrols had discovered evidence of, and May's desperate sincerity convinced him to at least investigate. He'd sent a squad of men to ride back with her, and they had arrived just in time. "It's over, May," Clyde said, reaching out to touch her arm to reassure himself she was real. "No," she said, her eyes dark. "It's not. Earl and his men, they're not just a county problem. The captain says this director mentioned in the ledger is a big name in the territorial government. This goes all the way to the top. They won't just let this go." She was right. As if on cue, a scout from the cavalry patrol came galloping back, his face grim. "Captain, riders coming. A lot of them. At least 50. They're flying the flag of the territorial militia." It wasn't a posse Earl was leading. It was a private army, sanctioned by his powerful friends in the capital. They weren't coming to arrest Clyde. They were coming to erase him, and everyone with him, under the guise of official business. The cavalry captain spat on the ground. "Militia, my foot! That's a lynch mob! We've got 10 men!" They were hopelessly outnumbered, trapped in the open plains with a private army bearing down on them. "We can't outrun them," the captain said. "We have to make a stand. There's a rock formation a mile ahead. It's our only chance." They raced for the rocks, the thunder of hoofbeats growing louder behind them. They dismounted and took up positions, a tiny, desperate band against an overwhelming force. Clyde found himself side by side with May, both of them holding rifles, preparing to fight for their lives. "Clyde," she said, her voice steady despite the approaching doom. "Thank you for everything, for seeing me as a person, not property." "May," he said, meeting her gaze, "whatever happens, it was worth it." The militia swarmed into view, a huge force of armed men led by Earl Thomas himself. He saw them cornered in the rocks, and a triumphant, cruel smile spread across his face. He had them. "Monroe!" he bellowed. "It's over! Give me the woman and the ledger, and I'll let your men live!" "Go to hell, Thomas!" Clyde yelled back. The first volley of rifle fire erupted, bullets chipping away at their stone cover. The battle began, a desperate, impossible fight. The cavalry soldiers were disciplined and brave, but there were too many attackers. One by one, they fell. Clyde's ranchers fought with the ferocity of cornered animals, but they were no match for the sheer numbers. Soon, it was just Clyde, May, and the wounded captain left. The ammunition was almost gone. The end was near. Earl Thomas, seeing their fire slacken, ordered his men to charge. They swarmed forward, ready to overwhelm the last defenders. Clyde stood up, ready to meet them on his feet, to die fighting. He looked at May, and she gave him a small, sad smile. They were going to die together, but then a new sound cut through the air. Not gunfire, a bugle call. Clear and sharp, it rang out from the hills behind the militia. Everyone stopped, confused. Over the rise, a line of blue-coated soldiers appeared. Not 10, not 20, 100. A full company of U.S. cavalry, their sabers drawn, their flag whipping in the wind. And at their head was a man with a long, flowing mustache and the insignia of a general on his shoulders. Earl Thomas's face went from triumph to sheer terror. He recognized the general. It was General Crook, the most famous Indian fighter and lawman in the territory, a man utterly beyond the reach of bribes or intimidation. The cavalry charged. They smashed into the back of the militia line like a hammer hitting an anvil. The corrupt militia, who were nothing more than hired thugs, broke instantly. They threw down their weapons and ran or begged for mercy. Earl Thomas tried to flee, but his horse was shot out from under him. He was surrounded, pulled from the ground, and thrown at the general's feet. General Crook dismounted and walked over to where Clyde and May stood, stunned and bleeding. "Mr. Monroe? Mrs. Thomas?" the general asked, his voice a low rumble. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Clyde, bewildered, just stared. I don't understand." "The boy," the general explained. "The stable boy, Thomas. He didn't just find your friend Captain Riley here, he kept riding. He knew the situation was dire, so he rode all the way to my main encampment. He rode for 2 days straight, nearly killed his horse, and told me the whole story. He also mentioned a name from the ledger that got my attention. The director." The general's eyes hardened. "I've been hunting the man behind that name for 5 years. He's been poisoning this territory, using scum like Thomas here as his puppets. I never had proof. Until now." He looked down at the sniveling Earl Thomas. "Your ledger, Mr. Thomas, is going to be the key that unlocks a whole lot of prison cells." The fight was finally, truly over. Justice came swiftly. Armed with the ledger, General Crook and his men swept through Oakage and the territorial capital. Judges, sheriffs, businessmen, the entire conspiracy was dismantled and arrested. Earl Thomas, in a desperate attempt to save his own skin, confessed to everything, implicating the director, a powerful senator who was arrested in a state of shock. Earl was sentenced to hang, not just for his financial crimes, but for the murder of the ranch hand, Billy. The Monroe Ranch was in ashes, but Clyde didn't care. The territory offered him compensation, but he refused it. That part of his life was over. He had no desire to go back to his solitary existence. He stood with May on a hill overlooking the valley, the place where his home used to be. "What will you do now?" he asked her. "I don't know," she said, looking out at the horizon. "For the first time in years, I get to choose. It's a little terrifying." She turned to him, a small smile on her face. "What about you?" Clyde looked at her, at the woman whose strength and courage had pulled him back into the world of the living. He saw the fire in her eyes, the resilience in her spirit. He saw a future he never thought he would have. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "of buying some land a little further west, a place to start over. But I don't think I want to do it alone." He reached out and took her hand. "May Turner," he said, using her real name for the first time. "Would you be willing to start over with me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "Yes, Clyde," she whispered. Yes, I would. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, as the sun set, two survivors who had found in each other not just safety, but a new beginning. They had walked through the fire and come out the other side, stronger and whole, ready to build a new life from the ashes of the old. If you enjoyed this story, and you believe in the power of courage to overcome corruption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got another story of justice and redemption coming your way tomorrow that you won't want to miss.